All right, so I'm very happy to have here as my interlocutor Shelia Payton, longtime Milwaukee native, somebody who has left and come back, which always adds a lot of needed perspective, I think, to this area in particular. She is, among many other things, what we can call a multi-genre writer, and so that's what I wanted to start by talking about. But I think we're going to range over a lot of different topics. So Shelia, you've written. You've been a journalist, writing a lot of stories. You have a book that you wrote for. What would we call them? Not just adolescents, but a little bit older, young adults, about how to make sense of life. I didn't know this until recently. You write librettos, so you've got a tie into the music industry. You've already written and produced one of your plays. You're working on another play. That's how I got to know you, through the Shut Up and Write. Have I left any other genres of writing out that you?
I think that's about it. I did work in marketing, so I did, some
copy, yeah.
ad copy. I was a freelance producer at Channel 1036 for a while.
That's right, yeah.
And so I did that, but if it can be done in writing, I can probably figure out how to get it done.
So a lot of people are good at one kind of writing, and it just doesn't translate into other kinds of writing. Why do you think that's the case?
I think I'll start this way. I tried to write my first novel in grade school.
Okay.
Then I went to poetry. I think what it is that writing is my core skill, but I think journalism had a real impact on making it possible for me to do a variety of things. And from this standpoint, as a reporter, you don't know what story you're going to be covering. So you might be covering a plane crash or some upheaval in the community, and then covering a meeting, and then covering a cat show.
because you're going where the stories lead, right?
Where the stories lead. And so the skills that I gained in journalism, I think, had a major impact on kind of my ability to go across. Because sometimes you write a news story, and news stories back then were who, what, when, where, why, and how.
Yeah.
Okay. And then you might turn around and do a feature story, which would be more explanatory, or might expose people to something they didn't know. For instance, I did a series of stories on a place called Overtown in Miami, which was predominantly African American area, and it was originally segregated. It was blocked off by a wall, but it was a very lively, vibrant community where people of all different economic levels, lived.
Yeah.
And so it was about the way it was, the way it is now, and the way people are trying to get it back to, and that's more of a feature story.
Yeah. Did that lead into other stories then?
It did. We did, during the 70s, there was, not specifically on that topic, but during the 70s, another reporter and I were sent out to look at the impact that the recession was having, the 70s recession was having on people in the African American community. The paper was doing a story about overall Miami, but they wanted to look at individual parts of the city also.
Yeah.
And so both of us thought, well, people are probably on their last legs and gasping for breath, and what we found was the exact opposite. And then my partner in the series found out, went to the university and found this guy that was a sociologist, and she said, why aren't these people dying in the street? And he said, because black people have always had to be resilient. And he had studied that. He wasn't just saying it, I've got the data to show. And so that ended up winning a state press club, but the series ended up winning a state press club award because, I think in part because it was not the traditional story, but it's what the story was.
Yeah.
And then the other piece that was helpful in terms of the different styles of writing was back when I was a reporter, you ask a question, you shut up, and you listened. And so what that did for me is it taught me how people speak. And
So when it comes to writing, say, dialogue, it becomes...
writing dialogue
okay.
and
Yeah,
that kind
yeah.
of thing, I can, and then after I left journalism, I went into corporate communication. Well, I went to work for a corporation, Miller, and I was hired originally as a speech writer, and
Okay.
I got them to hire me not because I had written all these speeches, but because I gave them that pitch. Well, I've been listening to people talk for 5 years now.
So you were crossing out of one genre into another and having to make an argument for it. Okay, that's yeah.
Yeah. But you know, one of the things that I learned, and I didn't realize that until I actually got into the job, is that I was writing speeches for the executives, and I would go in and I'd listen to one guy speak, and he sounded like a used car salesman to me, and another person sounded like a Baptist preacher, another one sounded like a professor, and so when I wrote in their rhythm, and that's a skill that I actually picked up as a journalist.
That's interesting. I suppose, I've never done any speech writing. I've done ghostwriting for authors, and usually when we think about audience, we're thinking about the people who are going to be reading it, but in a way, you've got to also consider the let's call them the client or the patron as an audience as well. They don't want something that isn't going to feel right to them.
Exactly.
Sort of like, almost like tailoring clothes, right? Except you're tailoring their linguistic patterns.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So obviously, being able to write dialogue is helpful when if you're writing a play, or even if you're writing a novel, because it's not just a novel as people talking and then describing things.
Yeah.
And I'm not as good at describing things as I am people talking, but so that's...
I think this is very interesting because I imagine some of the people watching are, would-be writers who probably think that, there's kind of like a hierarchy, right? So, doing corporate communication is lower than, say, writing novels just for the sake of writing novels. But, and so I think a lot of people probably figure, well, I should learn to write poetry, or I should learn to, write very artistic novels, and then I can easily translate that downward. But what you're saying is, in many cases, you're almost better off doing the sort of jobs, so long as you're writing, write what you're doing in terms of journalism or corporate communications, or even let's say you're writing jingles or something. It's going to teach you more probably than like going and doing an MFA somewhere.
Well, I don't want to kill everybody's idea. I mean, that they shouldn't go on and get some training somewhere. But I think it is helpful because in a way you almost have to be analytical.
Yeah.
I mean, for instance, when I went from speech writing to working in marketing, corporate communications, PR. And one of the things that they did at Miller at that time was they were owned by Philip Morris. Philip Morris obviously could not advertise because they were a cigarette company.
Yeah.
So they were open to any wild and crazy idea that you could come up with. But you had to show them how it appealed to the target audience and hit the bottom line. And so what that did is it helped me to have sort of an analytical approach to whatever it was that I was writing or whatever it was that I was doing.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of writers out there, and I have some of them as my students, and I'm not even teaching writing, who have the view that, well, if they've written something, everyone ought to, value it because it's their work, and that's just not the way. I mean, that's not the way I read something. If somebody puts a book in my hands and says, "Oh, this is really great," how do you know it's great? Well, it's my book. Well, I may not even read past the first couple pages if it doesn't bring me in. So.
And that's really, I mean, even in journalism. I remember I didn't write this line, and it's one of those I have envy every time I say it. But there was, I can't remember where. I think it was West Virginia or someplace like that, where they had this massive mudslide that killed a lot of people.
Yeah.
And the opening line on the news article was, "They're burying a generation today."
Oh, wow.
And so journalism, so the ability to, even in journalism, being accurate, and not making stuff up, you can grab people and drag them into the story.
Yeah.
So and that's really what's important in writing in general. I mean, whether you're writing a how-to book, or whether or not you're writing a play, or writing a news article, or whatever,
Yeah.
it's the first few paragraphs. What we were taught, I was Syracuse undergrad for journalism, and what we were taught is you find the most important piece of information and you put it at the top.
Yeah.
And then the rest of it is sort of filling in the blanks and explaining all of this stuff. And so if you don't, if you say the city council met today, and
Yeah, so what?
but if you say the city council passed a budget that raised property taxes by 20%, what?
Yeah, people will take notice that. Yeah. Yeah, I find that's, again, I read a lot of student papers, and you get a lot of hemming and hawing at the start, and the worst are the ones where it's, since the dawn of time, blah, 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 and you're like, just tell me about Plato, because that's what I asked you to actually write about. So, well, let's talk about your biography, because I think you've already mentioned a few points about it. You came to Milwaukee, and you then left, came back. You had a pretty, what would you call it? In some respects, a diverse career, but all centered around writing in one way or another. How did you end up leaving Milwaukee, and how did you end up in Miami, of all places? So.
Well, I think it was my junior year in high school. That's when you have to decide what you want to do.
What school you're going to go to.
What do I want to do when I grow up? So I had worked for the school newspaper, and I thought, oh, this is fun. And it was I graduated in '66, so there was a lot of stuff going on, during that time frame. And basically, what my brain said is, I like to write, and I want to do some kind of writing that has a positive impact on, other people's lives.
Yeah.
And so with all the things that were going on in the '60s in terms of the civil rights movement and things like that, and I was watching how the journalists and the media coverage was having an impact on the outcomes, I thought, well, I'll be a newspaper reporter, not thinking of the fact that there were very few people of color or women working for major media in the country.
Yeah.
And then everybody and their uncle except my parents
tried to dissuade you?
Tried to dissuade me, girl, they're not going to hire you.
Yeah.
And my parents' only comment was, well, we will not be alive forever, so make sure you can make money. And that was it.
Okay.
And so what I did...
That's pretty positive.
That's pretty positive. And so what I did was, they brought me up to, they were the kind of parents where you'd ask them a question and they'd say, well, why don't you go look it up and see if you can find the answer?
Oh.
Yeah, so we had
Yeah, that's good.
We had a set of World Book encyclopedias in the house.
We did too, yeah.
And so I said, okay, what are my criteria for going to college? And I said I wanted a place with a school of journalism, because I figured if they had a whole school, they'd have a lot more stuff to offer me.
Yeah.
And then I wanted a school that was had no more than 10,000 students, because I could have gone to Missouri, which was an excellent journalism school, but it was like 53,000 students, and I'm thinking, man, I'd get lost in there. So I did my research in the World Book Encyclopedia, and Syracuse popped up. And I had no idea at the time that it was one of the top J schools in the country, and so I told my parents, hey, this is where I want to go.
Yeah.
And so I ended up going out east, and that was and then the other thing is, my father said, you can go to school anywhere in the world except Wisconsin. And I went, you don't love me anymore?
He wanted you to get out of the state, though.
He wanted me to broaden my view of the world.
Yeah.
Not to say he didn't want me here, but he wanted me to broaden my view of the world.
Yeah.
So Syracuse met those three criteria. And when I got there, it was, again, there was a lot of stuff going on campuses between 66 and 70.
Yeah.
And so I did some writing for the school newspaper there, and then got to meet New Yorkers.
Yeah.
and got to meet people from other parts of the country and the world, and it really kind of broadened my view of, you know, what life is like and what the options are and what's possible.
Do you think, and we'll come back to the whole narrative in a moment, but so in Milwaukee we were kind of fortunate in for a long time having, and it's still pretty good, you know, the Milwaukee Sentinel as, you know, an award-winning newspaper. So do you think like having something like, I mean, we had the Journal too, and there was a rivalry. Do you think there was kind of a advantage in growing up in a place where you could actually have a great paper in your hands? I mean, the Chicago Tribune is good too, and that's just, you know, 2 hours south of here. But I don't imagine you were reading the Trib, right? You were reading the
Right.
Yeah. So
I think that was very important, especially because they had two strong newspapers,
Yeah.
and they
had different skews.
and they had different skews, and that was important because the competition made them not only look at the same story the same way,
Yeah.
but look at the voids in the other paper
Yeah.
in terms of what was being covered, and so that was phenomenal. I ended up interning at the Journal Sentinel one summer.
Oh.
Yeah.
And while you were at Syracuse?
While I was at Syracuse, right.
Well, that must have been very interesting, because then you could compare what you were learning in journalism school with how things actually were happening on the ground, right? So what was that like?
It was interesting. The one thing that I learned when I got to Syracuse, which was really awesome, was that most of the professors there had been working journalists.
Oh.
So they not
Yeah.
only were able to say, theoretically, this should work. They would say, this is how you do this, and this is how you do that on deadline.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I imagine they probably didn't give a lot of extensions for papers or anything like that.
No.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, because that means that you had both the theoretical and sort of the craft knowledge getting integrated at the same time.
And that was very helpful. It was very helpful. The only thing that I can say that I didn't learn how to do at Syracuse was to dictate from my notebook on deadline. I mean, they didn't rehearse us on that. And the first time I had to do that, I thought I was going to die, because I'm on the other end of the county.
Yeah.
Covering something, and it needs to hit the paper, the first edition of the paper, and I run into the phone booth and I call in and say, "Hey, this is what happened." They say, "Okay, we'll put you on. We'll connect you with the rewrite guy and just dictate the story to him." And I went, "What?"
Because then you have to have it sort of all arranged up in your head.
You have to, yeah. But again, that was a skill that I learned.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm sitting there in the phone booth like that, and flipping through the pages and figuring out what's what.
Yeah.
And then but fortunately I got a really good rewrite guy. He'd say, "Okay, what's the most important thing that happened?" And then he would write it. And then I'd say, "Okay, now were there any quotes associated with that?" I mean, so he was kind of guiding me through the process, so that was helpful. But you asked me how I ended up in Miami.
Oh, yeah.
I had another internship at the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle, which is, Rochester. It's like Buffalo, Syracuse, Rochester, or something like that.
Yeah.
They're
all along like the river and the lakes. Yeah.
Yes, it's kind of like Milwaukee, Racine, Kenosha.
Yeah, you're right. It is.
And so the guy that was the managing editor at the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle got the job offer in Miami. And at the end of my internship, or toward the end of my internship, he said, "Hey, I'm moving down to Miami. Would you like to have a job?" I was 20, and I said, "Well, I had planned to go to grad school, and I've been accepted, and da-da-da." The neurons weren't firing off.
Yeah.
And he said, "Oh, well, how long is your program?" And I said, "Well, I'll be out next August." He said, "Well, give me your phone number." And so I must have done something well, because in July he called and said, "Would you like to come work?" And I went, "Okay." And so that's how I ended up in Miami. And that's very unusual, because normally when you start out, back in that day, if you start out a newspaper journalist, you go to somewhere in the middle of the country, or somewhere in a small town.
Yeah.
And you
work
work your way up. So to go from, basically
a small
college.
city to a major city. Yeah.
And not only that, to go from right out of college to working for one of the top 10 papers in the country was like unheard of.
Yeah.
But again, the timing was right because of the things that were going on in urban centers around the country. Newspapers were looking to hire people of color and women to cover the, to kind of bring a different understanding
Yeah.
to the newsroom. So
So I think a lot of people view that as the advantages would be people looking in from the outside can see kind of a Benetton color, sort of thing. But I think, and there's also the view like, well, everybody's got their background and perspective. I myself have found that backgrounds overlap an awful lot, and there's a lot of differentiation within it. But it seems like one of the advantages would be being able to get sources to talk to you who wouldn't talk with other people.
Yeah. And also that plus also picking up on the cultural cues.
Yeah. Yeah.
So someone may
knowing what questions to ask too. Right?
What questions to ask. Someone may see a situation and recognize. The example that I use, and this is not, and it applies to things beyond this. Is if I see a group of young men walking down the street with hoods on and sagging, I can tell the difference between those I need to watch and those that I'm afraid of. I mean, they're not afraid of, because they're just walking around being fashionable. I can know how to approach someone, let's say an older person, that may be reticent to, talk because,
to go on the record.
To go on the record, or, I'd say from my grandparents' generation back, it wasn't really, it could be dangerous for you to tell people too much about yourself. That kind of thing. And so make them comfortable enough to be willing to share some things, and not necessarily bad things or terrible things or anything like that, but just, open up a little bit, to answer the questions. And so the way you approach them, you don't come in and say, what's up, doing that. It's like, oh, really? Okay, so what'd you think about that? That kind of approach.
Giving them the opportunity to say what they want to say.
Right. And then pausing, like I said, you ask the question.
So you've brought that up
the
twice.
Silence.
Yeah. So that's actually, that's kind of a good lead into talking about your dramatic work. You mentioned the need to listen, and here you mentioned the need for almost like timing, right? And, in order to, so you've written you're in the process of finishing your second play. You've written one play. Plays are essentially dialogue with a few stage directions. And what makes them work is somebody, just like with music, you can have the notes there, but you have to know how to phrase them properly. How do you get that across to, when you, it's sort of like you've got your baby there. How do you put your baby into the hands of somebody who's actually going to have the right phrasing? How can you tell that?
Well, I was fortunate in that the subject matter of my play happened to sync up with the sesquicentennial of the Civil War.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
And so I had sent my play to a theater company in St. Louis, and hadn't heard anything from them, but that wasn't anything new. It happened before. And then all of a sudden I got a call from them saying, hey, we're interested in doing your play. And I went,
how much advance notice did you have?
Well, it was pretty good. I think they called me in the maybe the late summer, and the play was actually going to be produced in November. So we had a little time.
That's only a few months.
That's only a few months.
Yeah.
But it was. The play was done.
Yeah.
So it turned out that the theater company had partnered with the Historical Society. And they were doing this programming around the sesquicentennial, and so the guy from the Historical Society said, wow, I really wish I had a play about free women of color prior to the Civil War, and the theater person
That's
said,
pretty specific.
I know. And the theater guy went, I think I know somebody. Hold on a second, I'll call.
Wow.
And that's really what, those are the characters in my play.
Okay.
Free women of color, and the short version of the story is these women are having their book club meeting. They call them literary societies back then. And during the course of the play, they discover a stowaway in the house, and they have to make a decision whether or not to help the person escape to freedom. And the challenge, in today's world would be, of course we do this. But back then, had they been caught, they and their families would have been sold into slavery. So that's kind of the tension.
I mean, you could say that there could be parallels today to you've got somebody who's an undocumented immigrant, and you know that ICE is looking for them, and and your family background, maybe it's not something having to do with, I don't know, immigration, but there's something that you don't want people to look into.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so we actually did a production. I mean, I ended up working with the director.
Yeah.
I went down for the very beginning of the rehearsals, and then I came down and I came, prepared to make edits as necessary, and then I came toward the middle of the rehearsal and development stage, and we had conversations. Basically, it went, she was directing it, but there were little nuances like she said, well, why don't we have so-and-so come in, and she'll pick up something and eat it and walk around the room. I said, okay, these are Victorian ladies in the 1800s. They will not touch a piece of food without praying over it first.
Yeah.
And she went, you're absolutely right. But there weren't that many different things like that. But there were a couple of times where I just kind of, said, okay, now we got to what I want to do is bring the authentic sensibility there versus what we would do.
Yeah.
And then I came obviously for opening night.
So that's actually, I want to come back to this, but that's a good sort of topic as well. When you're talking about the authentic sensibility, and you're talking about things in the past where our mores have changed,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm not talking about big picture things.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about the like you mentioned how people would actually eat, how they would comport themselves. How do we recapture that? I know for you it happens through research, because I see every time that we're meeting for Shut Up and Write, you have your books along.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How do you translate that into, you might say, almost being like, you've got one foot here solidly in the 21st century, and you've got another foot back in the 19th century as sort of, I don't know, a translator. How do you do that?
Well, that's where journalism came in again.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, because part of what you would do is research.
Yeah.
And as I said, you never knew what story you would be covering. And so if you're going to a cat show, you don't have to do a lot of research. But if you're going to go and interview somebody, there was I've forgotten who he was. He was like the secretary of HUD or something like that, was in town for something. And I had no clue about the topic, so I did some quick research to at least be able to ask questions that sounded reasonably intelligent.
Yeah.
And then when I got through with it, he said, that's the most thorough interview I've ever had. So research was one of the skills, and quick research. So what I did, for instance, with the play was I said, okay, I know the big picture thing about the Civil War era, but I don't know the fine points. So I said, okay, what were people eating? What were they reading? What their clothes looked like? What music were they listening to? What were the issues that were going on? That had their attention.
So how did you find that out? I mean, did you go back to a lot of newspapers and reviews and things like that from the time?
I did research on the internet.
Yeah.
But I did it by, you Google things. It's like, okay, what?
And then you start going down rabbit holes.
And then you start going down rabbit holes, and then you come back up for air.
Yeah.
But I started doing those things. Trying to really understand. And what I found out, the reason I said it in Baltimore is what I found out was that Baltimore, Maryland
Yeah.
was a slave state. Baltimore was like Madison, Wisconsin, the hippy dippy place.
Oh, interesting.
In terms of race relations.
Yeah, yeah.
For their time, don't get carried away. Everybody it wasn't all kumbaya.
Yeah, yeah.
But it was that, and I thought, well, that's more interesting than setting it in Mississippi or Alabama that was like hunkered down.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. So I said, okay, I want to do that. And then I also said, okay, what interesting things? I mean, I literally woke up in the middle of the night one night with 1859 in my brain. Don't ask me why. But
that's why you said it in 1859?
I said it in 1859.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because I wanted to set it close to the Civil War time, but before the Civil War.
Yeah.
And I said, okay, so now let me go see what was going on in 1859. And I found out Harper's Ferry happened in 1859.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, okay. Oh, I wonder how close Harper's Ferry is to Baltimore. Oh, they're like 50 or 60 miles away.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. And then I read up on Harper's Ferry. And what did I find out? That John Brown and his folks stopped a train that was on its way to Baltimore and held it for a while. And the way that people found out about Harper's Ferry is that for some reason they decided to release the train and let it go all the way to Baltimore.
Oh, wow.
And I thought, yes!
Yeah.
So I look for those little pieces like that.
Yeah.
Generally when I start writing, if it's fiction, I know the beginning, and I have a sense of the beginning, and I know what the end is, or have a sense of the end. And so all I need to do then is to fill in the stuff in the middle.
The big part.
The big part, yes. The 500-mile slog from beginning to end.
Do you map out the way some authors do? You've got your end points, and then you actually map like what each character is doing at what point, or something like a storyboard, or? No,
actually, and again, this is the journalism piece.
Yeah.
What I did was I had like piles of research, and so what I did after I got my piles of research was I went through and I read everything, and I highlighted it in different colors. This might be a good dialogue point, or this might be an interesting scene, whatever. And I highlighted it in different colors. And so as I was writing, I'd say, oh, I need to have something happen here. I knew that was highlighted in blue. Okay. So I would go through my pages and figure out what would make sense in the context of, the story.
I imagine you must have had at least 10 times more stuff than what actually went into it.
Absolutely.
So one of the difficult things for writers often is cutting. I imagine that the journalism part probably helped with that as well, right?
Oh, yeah.
You have to, everything has to be very trim.
Right.
Whereas a novel, you can make it as sprawling as you like.
Yeah. It didn't happen all the time, but sometimes, the editor would say, you got a page and a half to say it. And I've just done, and I've just covered the city budget. It's like, okay, let me figure out which is the most important stuff for people to know.
Did you ever feel bad about the material that was orphaned in that way? Did you feel like you'd somehow missed out by this part not being published, or were you okay with that?
It was okay, because the purpose, I knew what not the purpose, but I knew what I was trying to do with in the play.
Yeah.
I knew what I was trying to do. Now, there were other interesting things in there, but one of the things that journalism teaches you to do is to say, yeah, that's interesting, but does it move it forward? Does it move the story forward?
Yeah.
And so that was helpful to me. And the other thing is, I haven't thrown that information away. I still
turn it into something else.
It could be used somewhere else. And actually, the way that I found the book that the women were reading, when at the beginning of the play, was I said, okay, so what was the literature during that time?
Yeah.
A Tale of Two Cities. Opening line, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. that was exactly what was going on in the women's lives, because they, as I said, the Baltimore was relatively liberal.
Yeah.
But as the country moved closer and closer to civil war, some of the freedoms that they had enjoyed were being pared away, and attitudes toward them were changing as a result of the tension over the war that was
brewing.
Brewing, right? Yeah. And so I said, well, that's got to be the book that they're reading. And so I just, had them read the first paragraph and then start talking about it, and then not talking about it only in terms of the literature, but also in terms of what's going on in their lives. And you probably have never been to a women's book club, but that happens a lot. We talk about the book, and then we talk about what's going on in the world.
Yeah, I've been in a lot of book clubs, but they've always been, mixed, so to speak. I think the stereotype of women's book clubs, of course, is that they're excuses for women to get together and have some wine. But I mean, back in that day, they really served a very different purpose. So.
Oh, and the other thing that I found out that made me excited about doing the story was I found out that some of the literary societies, again through research, were part of the Underground Railroad.
Yeah, I remember you telling me about that, yeah.
And when I found that out, I said, if that's not drama, I don't know what it is.
So you found that out after you'd already started?
No, I found that out in my research.
Okay.
Yeah. So I researched until I felt like, okay, I've got enough to work with here. And then there were a couple of times as I was writing that I needed to do some additional research to kind of, to make things move logically to the next point. Yeah. But generally speaking, I had done all my research prior to that.
So your playwriting comes out of a process of research and almost like a fermentation, you could say, of all these different facts and entangled ideas. And how do you then end up, this is something we were talking about before, how do you decide what your characters are going to be like? Because you can have a great set of ideas, but if you don't have characters to move the story along that are compelling, that people can tie in with, you're just basically giving a sermon. Right?
Exactly. So, first of all, I figured, you can't have a book club with 2 people, so I knew it had to be about 5 people might be good.
Okay.
And then I said, okay, now who are these people? And if you think about Victorian ladies, you think about grand dames.
Yeah.
Okay. So I wanted to have a grand dame. Then I found out that there were people who were freed people who had gone on to live better lives.
Yeah.
And so I said, okay, I want one of those personalities in there. But in the play, it's not known until a very important point in the play that she had ever been enslaved.
Okay.
So that's one of those things where it's like, whoa. And then I wanted, kind of a firebrand kind of person.
Okay.
It's like
a rabble-rouser.
A rabble-rouser.
Yeah.
And then I found out that there was an AME church in the city.
Oh, yeah, that would make sense. Yeah.
That was very much involved in the anti-slavery movement.
Yeah.
So I had the pastor's wife in there. And then I thought, okay, now let's get somebody a little bit younger in there. I mean, these women are all in their 30s. Let's get somebody a little bit younger in there that's, just starting to, get her feet under her. And have her be the, the future, representing kind of the future, and facing, learning from these women how to be a good Victorian woman. She's single, but learning how to be a good Victorian woman, but at the same time, facing a future that's not as secure as the one that they had most of their lives.
Does she have to figure out then, like, what she can learn from them is probably still going to be usable, 10, 20 years down the line?
Her concern is more, will I have the same opportunity to first of all, the younger woman is the daughter of a friend of the woman having the
The book club.
The book club meeting.
Yeah.
And so it's not like she just popped in and said, "Hey, can I join you?"
Yeah.
But she had reached an age where being around them would be good for her grooming and upbringing as a good Victorian lady kind of thing. And maybe her mother talked to her. I hadn't thought that far, but maybe her mother said, "Would you mind if my daughter came to your book?" That kind of thing.
Sure.
But she was not necessarily there as a student. She was trying to, consciously as a student.
Yeah, it's part of her formation.
It's part of her formation, right? And but because she's growing up in different times, it's kind of one of the things that I thought about this weekend when the young people were.
Oh yeah,
that was awesome.
Did you go to the?
No,
I went
I had to work
at the courthouse. I didn't know that it was happening. I just heard the helicopters overhead, so I was like, something must be going on. And then Andy looked it up, and I saw that they were having the rally. So I popped over there, and the entire courthouse square was totally filled.
That's what
spilling over into the other areas. And then you look at the DC march.
Yes.
Yes. Hundreds of thousands.
Hundreds of thousands.
It's kind of gratifying.
Yes, I teared up. I teared up when I saw that.
Yeah.
But one of the things that I remember them saying in some of the interviews prior to the march in D.C. was that we are the members of the Columbine generation.
Yeah.
And I went, wow.
Yeah.
How, and so that's the kind of person that she was, that she's sitting there thinking, they had wonderful lives, and look at how, smooth things have gone for them.
Yeah.
And I'm a single person, I want to live the same kind of life, but I don't know if I'll be able to because the way things are changing around me.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what her conversation was. Or her comments were.
That's her motivation.
Her motivation is, how do I I call it living in a bubble, because the ladies had been living in a bubble, pretty much compared to others.
Everybody else.
But she was concerned that she wouldn't have a bubble to live in, and she wanted to have that lifestyle, not for any selfish reason, but just that's what she had grown up in, and she just wanted to continue it.
Interesting.
And so what I did was I, put down the name and the age of the person, and then I actually wrote maybe a quarter to half page bio on each one of them. And then that way it kind of helped me focus on who they were.
And how they might talk.
And how they might talk and that kind of thing,
Does it help you figure out, when, I imagine there's some conflicts within the play, as there are in any successful play. Does doing that give you an idea of, who should wind up in conflict? Or are you, when you write, are you the kind of writer who finds their characters doing things and then is surprised by it?
I'll have to pause on that and think about it. I think in my mind they're pretty developed.
Yeah.
But for instance, with the woman who had been enslaved and they didn't know it.
Yeah.
She was not, I didn't know she's the one that kind of went, hey, how about this idea?
Okay.
And so that I hadn't thought through. It's just like I knew that she was going to be there, but I didn't know what her role would be. I knew what the firebrand's role would be. I knew what the young woman's role would be. I knew what the grande dame's role would be. I knew what the, who's the other one I'm missing? The
the one who's the younger one who's learning, yeah.
Right, and then so I knew what every character's role would be, but not this one. And then all of a sudden, it occurred to me that she would be the bridge between the person trying to escape and these Victorian women that were multi-year, multi-generational, free.
Yeah.
So So that's how I came up with her role in the play.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit about your new play that you're working on.
Well, the one I'm working on now is, it's always intrigued me how people can, human beings can not like each other. I mean, let's be real.
Yeah.
Hate each other.
Yeah.
For no apparent good reason.
Yeah.
And so what I'm trying to do now, and I don't know exactly when it's going to be set. It's either going to be in the 1600s or the 1800s. I haven't figured out yet. But what I'm trying to do is kind of look at the origins of racism.
Yeah.
And I want it to be a play where it's not punch in the face, punch in the face, punch in the face. I want the play to be, it's going to be a smaller cast probably.
Okay.
But, characters who they're both indentured, but one happens to be African American, one happens to be European.
Okay.
And they're getting along fine, and but they're at that pivot point where things start to change, and you see their relationships start to change.
So this is taking place over a number of years then?
Probably, yeah,
Okay.
yeah, or maybe, yeah, it would because maybe Act 1 would probably need to be kind of more the beginning of their relationship and that kind of stuff. And then in Act 2, you see the shifting, and you begin to realize what the shifting is about. And it's not about them as people, but it's more outside pressures that, kind of impact their relationship. And there's I haven't figured out exactly what yet, but there's a very subtle shift that happens. It's not one of these, again, punch in the face kind of things, but there's a very subtle shift that happens that makes you go, dang.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So that's kind of the arc of that play.
They could both survive seasoning together at the beginning, which killed off so many indentured servants in the Carolinas,
Mm-hmm.
in Virginia.
Mm-hmm.
You think about how terrible summers are
Mm-hmm.
down there now. Imagine it without any
Mm-hmm.
amenities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, before we run out of time, because I know I want to be conscious of the time, let's talk about some of the props that you brought, which you have to do with writing. Mm-hmm. So you've got this, well, I was going to talk about this book. So
okay.
Essentially you have a book for teenagers,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Well, I would say late teens or
Into
early
20s?
adults. Mm-hmm.
So this could be something for college student age
absolutely,
kids.
absolutely.
And it's a set of short essays, very sort of down to earth titles, and they're several pages each. I got to read through the one on anger and hatred that you've got here, and what got you thinking that you wanted to write? It's not a self-help book as such.
Mm-hmm.
It's more like a here's how to figure things out book, right?
Right.
Because you don't have a system.
No, I don't have a system.
I should hold it up. So what got you? You hadn't done that sort of writing before, right?
I hadn't. What prompted me to write the book was I have my oldest niece was living in another state.
Oh.
And she was about to become a teenager.
Okay.
And and I wanted to share my years of wisdom with her.
So this is almost of the genre letters to a young.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I didn't want to, if I talked to her on the phone, I wanted to say, "Oh, babe, the way you do this and you do that," I didn't want to do that. So I said, okay, letters to.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, the working title was Letters to My Niece.
Oh.
And so I thought about all of the different experiences I'd had.
Yeah.
And then all of, and how I had, navigated the waters and that kind of thing. But then I also thought about examples from other people's lives. There's an essay in here that talks about the Olympics, and I've forgotten exactly when and where it was, but it's mentioned in the book.
Mm-hmm.
But there was a runner who was doing a marathon, and he was way past medaling. I mean, everybody else had gone in, and it had to be Atlanta because I was there. And he had everybody else had gone in, and he was still running to finish the race.
Yeah.
And when people realized, in the stands realized that, they stood up and cheered for him until he crossed the finish line. And that's really how I came up with the title, What Counts Most is How You Finish.
Oh.
Because he had set a goal for himself.
Yeah.
Obviously, his initial goal may have been to win a medal. But the bottom line was he wasn't going to do that. But he had set a goal to represent his country and finish the race. And so I use examples like that in addition to it. And what I do is I have the essays under different headings. So, being you, dealing with people, overcoming obstacles, so that it's almost a reference book, because when you're in that age group,
right.
The likelihood of you reading a 200-page book, somewhere between slim and none.
Yeah, but I mean, a lot of the topics are things that you can picture a young person really. I mean, in a way, they're the sort of things that they might not want to ask somebody about. Now I think a lot of them would go on the internet and Google the stuff. But, this strikes me as the sort of thing I would want my kids to have.
And I actually did road test it before I published it, because
how did you do that?
Well, I asked somebody that I knew,
Yeah.
who was a principal at a high school.
Oh.
I said, would you, is it possible for me to maybe get some of the kids to, read
Portions of it?
portions of the book and give me some feedback?
Yeah.
And she said, and I explained it to her, and I sent her some of the pieces. She said, oh yeah, let me talk to the English teacher. He took it as the whole book, and took it as because he was teaching critical thinking.
Oh.
And so he took it as a text for them to do critical thinking.
Okay.
And so they had different segments. I think I gave them like maybe 20 or 30 pages each, so so their brains wouldn't fry.
Yeah.
And then I came in and they gave me feedback on it. Because I wanted to make sure that whatever I said didn't just make sense to me.
Yeah.
And then the feedback was helpful. And then I also knew someone who worked for the North Central Y, and I did some focus groups there.
Okay.
And so the idea was, again, to make sure that it made sense to the audience and not just to Sheila, so that she could sit there and say, yes, I have a book.
Did you have any sections or essays then that either you got rid of or you revised very heavily?
Yeah, and it's been a while, so I don't remember, but I do remember making some revisions, because one of the things, again, thinking about language and what makes sense, I mean, if I make a literary allusion to something that nobody has any idea what that is, I've just lost them. So I made sure, what I wanted to do is to make sure that my language was correct, and there was one essay where they kept saying, I have no idea what that means. And
interesting.
Okay, so let's go back, and then I asked questions to get an understanding of where the barrier, where the wall was.
Yeah.
And then went back and rewrote it so that it made more sense.
I remember some of my colleagues in philosophy getting irritated over the fact that they could no longer use, or no longer count on, they kept using them, Star Trek metaphors. Because the new generation, I think, was sort of the last cultural touchstone. There were a few other Star Trek shows after that, but they weren't really that well watched. And the students, you can't count on them really knowing anything.
Exactly.
And they kept on wanting to talk about, for example, in terms of rationality, Mr. Spock. Well, that's 30, 40 years ago. I mean, how the hell would these kids know anything about that?
Exactly.
And but they kept on pushing it and pushing it and pushing it. You do the opposite, which is to think that there's some merit in actually reaching out to your audience.
Yes. And again, that's the journalism and the marketing piece, coming together, because I could have the world's greatest whatever.
Yeah.
But if you don't, the Whiffam thing, if you don't see what's in it for you, why would you bother to take your time or spend your money?
Yeah, that's true. Let's talk about another genre, and it's not exactly writing, it's more editing, I'd say, right? The black pages.
Oh, right.
And I don't think that most people in the audience will know what this is. So it's like the Yellow Pages, but it's different. Why don't you tell us first what it is, and then why did you start this project?
Okay. I once I left Miller, I started my own marketing business.
Yeah.
And there was a woman who actually started the publication in Milwaukee, and it's national, or it was national. I don't know. It was initially started in Atlanta, Georgia.
Okay.
And then there were black pages, independently owned black pages in communities around the country. And the intent was to encourage people to buy from black-owned businesses and businesses that support, development and things in the community. Because, we live in a capitalist society, and
just a vote with your pocketbook sort of idea.
A vote with your pocketbook kind of thing. And, the more times the dollar circulates within the community, the bigger the impact it has.
Yeah.
And so it helps communities become more self-sufficient and not relying on outside resources to, make things work.
Yeah.
So I was an advertiser in her directory. And then she decided she wanted to run off and get a Harley Davidson dealership, or she was offered one, and she went, I could do that.
Yeah.
And so she got one, and I said, oh, well, what are you going to do with your directory? I don't know. I guess I'll have to sell it. And because it fit with what I was doing, which was to try to help businesses, as in my marketing business, try to help businesses to promote their business.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me. And so I bought it, and with each edition, I promote.
So we've got the black pages here. This is the Wisconsin black pages. Why don't you tell us what this is, how you got involved with it, and why you think it's important?
Okay. Well, the Black Pages franchise, if you want to call it that, is really something that started in Atlanta years ago, where somebody decided that they wanted to promote the idea of buying goods and services from businesses owned by African Americans. And then it kind of spread across the country, and people basically started, doing the same thing. And at the time, I had a small marketing business, and the person who actually got the franchise in Milwaukee, it's not really a franchise; it's almost like an independent business.
Okay.
But you do have the rights to use the term Black Pages. But she approached me about advertising, and she explained what the purpose was, and I thought, oh, sure, fine, I'd love to be in there. And then she had an opportunity to get a Harley Davidson dealership,
which is a big thing here in Milwaukee,
which is huge. And she decided that she was going to get out of the business. And I said, "Oh, so who's going to buy it? What are you going to do with your publication?" She said, "Well, I'm going to sell it." So I bought it from her because it fit in with what I was trying to do, which is to help small businesses to get some airtime.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why that's important is that the more times dollars circulate within a community, the stronger that community is. Because, if I'm building a business,
mm-hmm.
and I hire the people who put up the building, and I hire people who for security guards, and I buy
from suppliers,
people who clean the building, and I hire people who maybe have a food store and I buy from them, then that helps those businesses grow so that they can hire more people. And so I've been doing this since about 1999. And one of the things that I have always focused in on is the economic benefits
Yes.
of doing that. One of my, not this particular book, directory, but one of my earlier directories, I found out that it was like about $2 billion touch the hands of African Americans in the city of Milwaukee.
Per year?
Per year.
Yeah.
And I went, whoa, and we're not talking just, people in a certain neighborhood.
Yeah.
And so my essay was about if, I think the ratio is 2 to 1. So if the dollars circulated, twice
Yeah.
in the community, that would have an impact of this.
Yeah.
In this particular book, I call them books, but it's a directory. My essay is about something that I didn't know anything about. Apparently, there was a study that was done by a university professor, and she found out that the more African American owned businesses you have in a community,
Yeah.
the lower the violence level is in that community.
Well, that makes sense.
And it was, I went, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
And so the essay was about the fact that it's not just about buying from somebody, it's
Yeah.
about, helping the community to become, more cohesive.
I mean, a business would include not just hiring, but also sponsorship of institutions,
Right.
mentoring.
Right. And showing kids that there's a plan
Yeah, yeah.
B, C, D, E, and F, other than,
So this is something we were talking about earlier. This is, one of the most segregated large cities in the United States. And yet, when we meet downtown, you'd never guess that. Is this more important in a city like Milwaukee than, say, I don't know, Chicago's pretty segregated as well, but it's not as segregated as Milwaukee is.
it's not as, it may be segregated, but it also is more economically diverse
Yeah,
than Milwaukee, in communities of color. And so I think it's very important because I live in Cold Spring Park area.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a neighborhood it's like literally 5 minutes drive from downtown Milwaukee. And it's an area that's kind of in transition.
yeah,
And so I see people, during the day walking up and down the streets that have no jobs. I see, people who, they're homeowners there,
Yeah.
obviously. But I see, young people who look like they've got the weight of the world on their shoulders, and they're going to grade school, and I'm like, really?
yeah,
And so one of the things that is important is not only the job creation piece, but seeing somebody else who is doing okay and giving them the belief that could happen. That happened to me on my block years ago, where this woman was living in one of the rental properties, and she, I was getting ready to drive off, and she came over to my car, and I saw, out of the corner of my eye, I saw this face up against my windshield, and my window, and I was like, okay, who is this? And I look around, and she drank a lot, so I kind of cracked the window, and I said, hi, how you doing? And she said, I'm okay, and then she said, you know what? I see you going to work every day, and I think I'm going to try to get myself together.
oh wow,
And I was like, whoa, I didn't even know she was paying attention to me.
Yeah.
I used to wave at her as I left, but
Yeah.
so it's those kinds of things. This is an adult, so think about what it can mean to kids to see somebody
yeah,
that's not an athlete, an entertainer, or a criminal,
yeah,
which are the three primary areas that everybody knows they can do, and I'm not saying that that's it. I grew up in Milwaukee when it was literally segregated.
Yeah.
With the redlining stuff.
yeah,
And you weren't allowed, you weren't supposed to be, I never crossed the viaduct to the south side in my entire life until probably after I came back to Milwaukee, and it was a few years before that. I felt comfortable doing that because it was, could be hazardous to your health.
Yeah.
But on our block, both of my parents were college graduates. We had people who were working in blue-collar jobs, working in, industry at the time when it was, you could...
Pretty viable, yeah.
Pretty viable. I think we had one family that was on welfare. We had a jazz musician who lived on the block, So kids had a variety of models to look at and say, oh, I think I want to be that one. No, maybe that one over there. But now, I think part of the issue is that the segregation is not only racial, but it's economic.
Yeah, very much so.
And so it's harder for them to see beyond the three options that are, that they can see on TV. And so that to me is why this is more important. It's not so much I am making no money on this. So I call this my charity project. Yeah.
Well, and you're investing a lot of time too.
And I'm investing time.
Yeah.
But I think it's important because it not only promotes the idea of entrepreneurship, and it not only promotes the idea of supporting businesses, but like I said, the essay talks about the impact. In this particular book, in each book I put information in above and beyond zip codes and things like that that I think would be helpful for people to know. This particular book, I have all the information you need to know about being able to vote.
Oh.
And I did that intentionally because I knew that, we were going to have some major elections coming up this year.
Yeah.
And it's not saying vote for anybody. It's here's the process. Here's what you do. Here's where you go. Here's contact information. Here's phone number. That kind of thing. So that's part of my public service, to the community. And I see this as both meeting those two purposes: economic improvement as well as helping people understand that they can't move past.
I think that's very important. And in one way, it connects with like a long tradition of cultivating self-reliance, right? Mm-hmm. And development through economic means rather than just trying to, let's seize political power or something like that. Economics is something that happens day in, day out. Mm-hmm. I'm also reminded when I taught at Fayetteville State University, one of the big problems we had, Fayetteville State is a historically black college, about 70% African American students. And we had a hell of a time holding on to young black male students. And one of the issues was that sort of, I don't want to show myself as too smart, because if I do, then I'll get ridiculed. I won't be, viewed as manly.
Authentically black.
Exactly, yeah. And I think you probably see something similar with, you're going to be a business owner, But it seems very important because those are the things that allow people genuine freedom and give them some, another issue is having equity. Most people, the equity that they have is in whatever home they happen to be paying the mortgage on, if there is that. Mm-hmm. But business ownership allows a different kind of equity and opens up a lot of other doors. Is it growing year after year?
With the book?
Yeah.
No, it pretty much stays the same size. Okay. Although I'm keep trying to come up with ideas to kind of get it to grow. It's interesting. You're talking about Milwaukee being a different place. There was a woman who had a book in Rockford, Illinois, and it was about that.
That's a city that's in a rough condition. I've been down there. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah.
But her book was about like that.
Wow.
And
they're much smaller than Milwaukee.
They're much smaller than Milwaukee. And at the time, we used to have Black Pages conferences, around, we convened in a city. Okay. But anyway, so I saw her book and I said, how is it that your book looks like that and mine looks like this? And she said, Milwaukee is a very tough market because people's minds have been, kind of caged, and they're thinking, what difference is it going to make?
So it's despair.
Despair, or the opposite, or not the opposite, but also jealousy. I mean, I had somebody helping me with some sales one year, and there was an organization that was in the healthcare area that was working very hard to, that's when they were just starting to discover the healthcare gap.
Yeah.
And they were working to try to close the gap. And so she offered them the opportunity to be in the Black Pages. And the response she got was, I saw Sheila at a Bucks game, she doesn't need the money. And I'm like, so I'm here to help you achieve your goal. And if you saw me at the Bucks game, that meant that you were there too.
Yeah, that's true.
Help me out here.
Yeah.
So those two things are, kind of make it more difficult.
Yeah.
And part of it is, it's not just, that people just hate each other or, do things. When I grew up, the place where Fond du Lac, the 145 spur drops off, that was the heart of the Black business district.
Okay.
That's where they decided, the city of Milwaukee in its infinite wisdom decided to put the spur that drops off on Fond du Lac.
Yeah.
And they said they were going to connect it to the rest of the expressway, and this was back in the 60s, the rest of the expressway, so you have this big loop covering the city. It never connected.
Yeah.
What they did is they destroyed the heart of the Black business district in Milwaukee. So, so it's there are a lot of factors that have come into play, but the bottom line is, and I keep saying this to folks, and they keep looking at, well, not all of them, some of them agree, but some people look at me like, and what planet are you from? My father was a Marine, and he also grew up in the South. Both my parents grew up in the South, and they always told me the best way to find a helping hand is at the end of your own arm. Not meaning that you don't ask for help, not meaning that you don't accept help.
Yeah.
But don't assume the cavalry.
Don't count on.
Don't assume the cavalry is on their way.
Yeah.
And I think, and we also had what we call the village, which is the adults who said all of these are our children, and we're going to make sure they're going to be okay. And that declined.
Yeah, that intergenerational security net almost.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And part of that, my father was a social worker initially, and then he went into juvenile justice. He was a probation officer and probation supervisor at Children's Court. While he was a social worker, and I'll be real quick, while he was a social worker, the powers that be started instituting rules that made it more difficult to keep families together. One of them was no man in the house, even if the man was the married father of the children, because otherwise the family would not be eligible for welfare.
Oh, yeah.
And he started out stabilizing people on welfare and then helping them to move back out in the market. In the juvenile justice system, when my father died, one of the people that spoke at his funeral said, Mr. Payton used to be my PO. And I'm looking, I'd known him for years, and I'm like, what?
Yeah.
And then he explained that he had, done stupid stuff as a kid, but that he had been able to help him understand the error of his ways and help him to see the possibilities, for his future.
Yeah.
And the punchline was, and today I'm an adult probation officer. Some of the things my father was able to do as a probation officer and supervisor, again, the powers that be start instituting rules that prevented him from doing that.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of factors that come into play, that make it more difficult for things to happen. But still, we need to try to encourage people to say, we're here, we got a block, we're controlling the block, and we're going to make it work.
Yeah. So, do you see prospects for doing that within the Milwaukee community as it currently exists?
I think I think it can be done, and I think the churches can play a role in that. Churches are doing a good job of taking care of people and feeding them and that kind of thing. But I think also if they could help them to understand how the system works and how to work the system to their benefit and work with them in terms of doing that. And then maybe get them to basically say, this is our turf, we got a block and this is ours.
Yeah.
And then have them, to reinstitute the village one block at a time. Everybody wants to make Milwaukee great, and it's such a big place, and there's so many things that need to be done, that going for the whole city is like trying to eat an elephant in one sitting.
Yeah, yeah.
But if you get yourself
Even
block,
a whole neighborhood.
even a whole neighborhood.
Yeah.
But if you do it one block at a time, there's a possibility that you can get that block done, and then you move to the next block and let the first block know we're still here, help. We're still here to help. And then you get enough blocks together to create a neighborhood association, and now you got something rolling where the people are engaged in their own liberation.
I read something recently that Milwaukee has an extraordinarily high number of neighborhood associations. Somehow we're like way beyond the national average. Wow. I think we've got Los Angeles, I think we're like almost at the level of them. And it's in part because there are so many neighborhoods in Milwaukee that do have some sort of neighborhood consciousness. Mm-hmm. And then there's something about, I don't remember exactly the specifics, something about the tax structure as well. Mm-hmm. But it encourages, I think those are very useful organizations for doing that kind of work. One of the challenges, like with businesses, is if they become successful enough and start scaling up, then they let's take Miller, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, you worked at Miller. Miller isn't Miller anymore. It's SAB, and it's not really a Milwaukee business, although they have a nice park here and stuff like that. And that's the way the capitalist system works. And so one of the challenges is to figure out how do you keep doing the really great stuff, and don't not to say that it shouldn't grow, but how does growth take place without it then just becoming one more successful business,
But again, you go back to what does a business do? As a business grows, it impacts its feeder system.
Right.
Miller doesn't clean. Miller employees don't clean. Well, I don't think they I haven't been there in a while, but they probably have somebody come in to clean the building.
True. Yeah.
They have they have truckers who drive who may or may not be employed by the company, who drive their product to where it needs to go. They have all kinds of things going on. So, as a matter of fact, one of the jobs I had, I was a PR manager for two of the brands when the last 5 years I was at Miller. And
which ones were they?
Lowenbrau and Magnum Malt Liquor. You talk about opposite ends of
the
scale. And I had to get in the minds of both of those folks.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that I did was I said, okay, they gave me a budget. Shouldn't have done that, because I said, okay. I looked around and I said, okay, now who do I know that's got a tan that can produce, provide some of the services I need?
Yeah.
And so I went out and I found people who had the, qualifications to do the job, and I invited them in to do a presentation. And then literally, after we had done the formal business thing, I closed the door on them and I said, how many times have you been in this building to do business? Oh, this is my first time. Okay, and why are you here?
Yeah.
Because you invited me in. Okay, don't make me
look
bad.
So you do the same thing.
No. I said, don't make me look bad, because if I'm not here, you don't get to come back.
Yeah.
And I said it in a joking way, but seriously.
But you meant it.
But I meant it. And there was nobody that I had to fire. I mean, they did their thing, and one catering business looked like they were showing up every week with food.
Yeah.
And so given that opportunity, I use my resources to try to do that. Mm-hmm.
Well, so that fits in too with the sort of circulation of money that you were talking about. I don't know if all the viewers will, and we're almost out of power for this, but the idea is that the more times that a dollar exchanges hands within a particular community, it's increasing the power of that dollar to facilitate exchanges of services, right?
Exactly.
It doesn't actually make anybody richer, because it's still just $1.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And it is changing hands, but it allows people to get what they need more efficiently.
Right. And it actually does increase. I mean, because again, if I have to buy flour, and you've got a flour mill, and I buy it from you versus Pillsbury, somebody in another state, That's why they're always, the Small Business Administration in particular, has this push for buying local.
Yes, yes.
And that's why they do that. It's not just about businesses owned by people of color, it's about businesses within a community.
Yeah.
And so that rule applies regardless of the nationality of the owner of the business. The more it circulates within Milwaukee, and you're circulating, you're buying stuff from Milwaukee people, then those businesses will ramp up. They may not become Miller Brewing Company, they may not become Harley, but they may be hire 5 or 10 people.
Yep. Mm-hmm. So in the time that we have left, is there anything else that you wanted to say about your writing projects?
Well, the other
the music related things.
The two pieces. This is a tape of the opera that I wrote, and I'll tell the brief story on that. I found this really interesting story about this African tribal chief that had been captured to bring over here to be enslaved, and then he managed to escape. He became a pirate, and he roamed around the Keys for 20 years, terrorizing everything. And he was so good at what he did that I think it was Britain and France sent their navy over to get him
together.
Oh
wow!
Yeah. So anyway, I thought that would make a good story.
Yeah.
So I wrote the libretto, and it took me until I wrote it in '76, and it took me until 2000 something to find a composer. And it was a guy by the name of Neil Tate, who I later found out after I had, asked him if he would write the music, because I met him through.
That's okay. We'll still be recording on this.
So I asked him if he would, write the music.
Yeah.
And it turns out that he was the first black music director on Broadway, and he was living in Milwaukee at the time. And then I'm working with the music director at my church. We're doing an album, finishing up an album. It's called Bad Movie, and it's basically kind of social consciousness raising album that kind of deals with what's going on now.
Well, that's excellent. Mm-hmm. So it seems like, there's over and over again, there's like a story of, I reached out to this person, I tried this. You must be very tenacious when it comes to finding a place for your writings or finding collaborators. Do you have any advice for particularly young viewers who I think often lack that?
Keep asking. I mean, there's somebody out there that you're going to meet. Like I said, with Black Caesar, the opera, I asked some local people to write the music, and they looked at me like, they didn't even bother to look at the words. It just was like, who are you? You're not in the music. You're not in the music realm. I don't know who you are. But I didn't let that stop me. I didn't throw it away. And when I met Mr. Tate he was the music director at the African American Children's Theater.
Okay.
And I knew the person who was the founder of it, and I asked for an introduction. And he said, well, let me take a look at it. And he did, and he said, let's do it. And I went, how much? And he said, well, we'll just, write it, put together an agreement, and then, when we start making money, we'll just split it 50-50.
Yeah.
But he was from New York.
Yeah.
So don't be afraid to ask. Don't be afraid to be persistent. And you don't have to run people over and grab them by their ties and, drag them down the street or anything like that.
Yeah.
But there's, if you want to do something, there's somebody out there that you can work with. And also, network with people.
I was going to ask about that. Is it important to constantly be making contacts, or?
Yeah, it's important to make contacts, to and hang around. One of the essays in my book is who you hang with matters. If you want to move forward, hang around people who have that same mindset. Hey, I want to move and do this. I want to move and do that. I want to, I'm looking for. I don't want to stay where I am.
Just keep doing the same thing.
Just keep doing the same thing, and that's one of the things that I think is not happening as much. And part of it is that I was 6 when the Brown versus Board of Education ruling came down, and those in our generation, that's the desegregation. Desegregation of schools. And part of we had 3 things that we knew we were supposed to do. We were supposed to take advantage of the opportunity. we were supposed to move the football down the field, meaning don't just be happy to be there, but see how far you can, move into other opportunities. And then we were to do it in a way that did not make it difficult for people coming up from behind us to have the same opportunity. And so, so the idea of pushing forward, was not strange to me, or to our generation. And basically, for me, the way I worked, got my head around dealing with adversity in those circumstances was I started to see it as a chess game after I learned how to play chess.
Yeah.
And it's like, what do you have to do? You have to figure out what move you want to make. You have to figure out what counter moves somebody else can make. And then you see what other options you have before you make your move, kind of thing. And then you may not capture the queen, but you may knock off a whole bunch of other pieces before they finally.
I mean, do you think that younger people simply, in general, I mean, there's going to be exceptions, are not getting that sort of training?
They're not getting that, and they're not getting that because I think my mother was a teacher and a guidance counselor. In education, there was a tendency to educate the whole child.
Yes, yeah.
So in addition to the academic stuff, you had home ec, you had shop, you had after-school activities where kids could find a reason to want to to come to school besides the fact that their parents told them to.
Yeah.
And a group that they can affiliate with. And like, for instance, my mother started out as a home ec teacher. And what she would do was, when she was teaching cooking, she would say, okay, we're going to bake a cake today. And then and here's a recipe.
I remember you were talking about how she introduced math.
Math.
Yeah.
And so she gave everybody a quarter cup measuring cup. And she said, now we need a cup of flour. So we're going to have to figure out how many of these we need to put in the bowl to get a cup. So those kinds of things. So those things are not happening as much. And part of it is not so much a matter of teachers not trying. The system is different again.
Yeah.
We now have people who have decided that I have the curriculum that will save the world, and they're selling that to schools. And there was a woman, I've done some volunteer work in an MPS school, and there was a woman who was, I had worked with one semester, and she was rocking and rolling. And then the next semester, I came in, and she had a mini meltdown, and she said, people, we're not where we should be, I put up all this stuff and we're not where we should be. And so I talked to her after.
So it was because of the benchmarks that she was supposed to reach?
She was supposed to reach certain benchmarks. But the problem was that a month before school opened, the school switched the curriculum.
Oh.
So she was no longer operating off the curriculum that she had before.
Yeah.
And she had to take all of that stuff down, learn the curriculum, and then put all the stuff in place so the kids could operate in the framework of the new curriculum in a month's time. That's insane.
Yeah, that's practically impossible.
And so to me, I mean, teachers spend 4 years learning how to teach.
Mm-hmm.
So just because this company has a box with stuff in it doesn't mean that's going to be better than what they can come up with, because one of the things that the teachers used to do is identify the learning style of the child and then help them learn whatever the subject was in that style.
Yeah, so there's a lot less local autonomy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and my daughter and even my son talks about this as well, that they spend so much time prepping for standardized tests.
Yeah, exactly.
She's very disappointed that she's told we can't study this thing that you'd like to study because, that time is allocated to test prep.
Exactly, exactly. And you have people who may have like an inch deep knowledge of whatever the subject is for the test, but they don't necessarily, they're not able to integrate it, and they don't necessarily know how to critically think things through. So somebody says, oh, the room is on fire, the door's over there, but you can't leave by the door. Okay, I guess I'll have to die.
Yeah.
You know what? As opposed to, oh, heck no, let me get my cell phone out and call somebody.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not quite that bad, but you know, just the idea that we learn critical thinking skills. We learned, you know, we had what they call world history. We had U.S. history. Now, of course, you didn't have all the stuff in
civics too.
Civics,
which we don't have anymore. I think.
Civics, you know, so that's why people don't understand that the first words in the Constitution are "We the people," and we can hire and fire as we choose.
Yeah.
That's why they don't know that, because they're not learning that in school.
You know, I think my generation was the last to do sentence diagramming, and then that was considered, you know, to be oppressive, and we shouldn't force that on kids. Now, if we're teaching foreign languages, of course, we still use it because it turns out it works. But yeah, I mean, we could go on and on. I think about that. Well, is there anything else that you'd like to hit on or mention or talk about? I mean, you've had a great career. You're still in it, which is also something to look up to. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about?
You know what? This has been wonderful. I didn't know where we were going and how we were going to get there, but this has been a wonderful experience. And I think, you know, I've enjoyed it, and hopefully your viewers will, you know, find something of interest that was talked about.
I think so, yeah. Well, thanks very much for giving your time, and
thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah.